A very good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Scaling Workshop series by xto10x. At xto10x, we help startup founders and leaders on their scaling journey. Today's session is for HR leaders on how they can perform, how they can best do performance management that suits their organization's DNA. And to speak about it, we have two very special guests. First, we have our own head of people practices, Mr. Arun Vigneswaran. After his stint with Flipkart as an HR leader for a team of over 400, he and his team have helped over 150 startups navigate cultural challenges. Welcome, Arun. And I'm going to hand over the mic to
Thank
you
you.
to
Thanks,
introduce
Ria.
our next guest.
Thanks, Ria. Uh, First of all, thanks everyone for joining in. Great to have you here. Let me also welcome the guest today with whom I'm looking forward to have a interesting conversation. We have Naveen with us. Naveen heads HR, is a CHRO at Licious. He's someone who has been at the forefront of establishing a people-centric and at the same time a high-performance culture at Licious, and also carries rich experience from different companies, HUL, Starbucks, and has experimented with multiple people practices in scaling culture in these places. So looking forward to have a interesting chat from your experience of how you have scaled culture and specifically how you have used Perf as a tool and as a weapon to do that, Naveen. And thanks once again for being part of this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you for having me in this webinar. Really looking forward to share my perspective. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Super. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start off with just when performance management, just how it has evolved over the years, right? Right from this being about bell curve and segmenting people and bucketing people to now what it is in multiple other companies. It has gone through an evolution. The principles have evolved. You made a very interesting point also when we were chatting the other day, when you said that also there is a generational shift also along with it, which means that the millennials came to the workforce, and then this entire thing about bucketing people just did not make sense. So then, shift away from bell curve, no rating, forward-looking feedback, etc., came into the being. And now there is another generation which is there at the footsteps, which is the Gen Z, with a lot of workplaces are now grappling with. So it would be good to hear your perspective on how Perf has evolved over these years. And now, what do you think is the next evolution which is going to happen, considering that there's again a shift, which we are sort of living through and going through? Over to you, Naveen.
Thank you, Arun. I think firstly, I guess the performance management as a process has been there for many decades, perhaps, right? It's been an integral part of people management. So fundamental reason is obviously that when you have a group of people, you need a framework to make sure that they work together, they deliver the result. So as a concept, it's been there. Of course, it has evolved based on the context of the business, the different generations that we have seen over a period of time. It has got contextualized to, based on that need base, right? So I've seen in the conventional world where maybe a few years back or couple of decades back, paper-based, competence-based assessment. Then it has moved to goal-based assessment, and goals now started to evolve as well. Earlier, once in a year, used to set goals. Now it has become more often, right? With OKRs coming in quarterly, goal setting exercises to enable, all these processes works for the business. This is not just managing people, right? It is to ensure that all people work together to achieve the common objective. So how this works, right, is important to see. I think one change which I've seen is timeliness of this process. I think a decade back, if you were to reflect on some of the processes which were existing, goal setting used to happen perhaps after a couple of months or over, right, in the course of the year. But today, if you see, all this happens much before year has begun or quarter has begun, right? So the timeliness of these processes have evolved, and business leaders to started to adopt and embrace some of these processes to make it work for the business, right? So it's no more HR practice; it is a business process. I think that has really helped the business to sharpen the focus and manage the large set of people to synergize their efforts towards achieving the company's objective, right? And the second bit which I've seen evolve is also about how we do goal setting, right? It used to be primarily top down in the in a decade before, perhaps, right? If you have to just reflect on it. But today, it's a lot of startups, especially, you're solving problem which is unsolved. Not necessary that every, as a founder or as a leadership team knows exactly how to solve problems. So you need to have goals which are directional in nature, which comes from the leadership or founders. But at the same time, we need solutioning OKRs, which is sort of prepared or bottom-up exercise to identify how exactly we move in that direction, right? So both bottom-up as well as top-down approaches are more prevalent, in the current context that I see more often, right? So a lot of changes, and also the way you manage the performance or the criteria, etc., right? Or the rating system itself. You did allude to this as you in your opening comment. I think Gen Zs, especially the latest generation, don't like being judged, right, at work. Yeah. Not that others like, but I guess they accepted it better than, perhaps more than the current generation. So they want, give me freedom, right? I want flexibility. I want to bring my best. I have my method of getting it. So measure my performance, reward me for my performance, rather than prescribing me how I need to do or how I need to bring this performance alive. So they look for much more freedom. I think organizations have started to define some framework which allows much more freedom within that framework. So we call it as a freedom within framework. I think a lot of these things start to evolve, especially post-COVID world, where hybrid working environment is common terminology, where you need a lot more governance, which will allow people to bring their best in their own way, but at the same time have some framework to ensure that their contributions are aligned towards the direction company wants to move forward. So in the current context, I think the last question which you touched upon, right, the principles, right, of the performance management. According to me, there are few things which are very important for us to keep in mind in the current context. One is everyone needs clarity, right? So I think this is a great process to ensure that people have clarity of expectations or the directions, right? The second part is it should not be prescriptive. It has to be co-created, right? So combination of directional input, at the same time involving people in the process, so that you are able to ensure that the buy-in of the people in terms of the choices we make, in terms of the objectives, etc., and hence greater discretionary effort to be able to bring on table, right? Have tangible measures, right? For each of their measures could be input or output oriented, depending on the type of OKRs or goals you're chasing. But you got to have tangible measures defined. This is not something which is very new. It's been there. We've been talking about SMART goals for long enough now. But I think this is still a most relevant thing, right? But I think the other principle is about the fairness of the process, right? Fairness underlined, very important. People will not trust, or I think trust is important piece for people to really, stay in the organization and see that, they contribute and bring their best and bring their discretionary effort. Without that, doesn't happen. So how do we ensure process fairness, which sort of builds a greater credibility to the whole process, right? And rewarding for results as well as efforts, right? Both are important. I think, especially in a startup context, if I have to reflect a little more deeply, we may be failing in 5 out of 10 things that we do, and failure is important part of learning, right? So how do we quickly fail and learn so that 5 things which we succeed, we really succeed with the scalable solution, so that startups can be built in a faster pace. So I think, how do we ensure that we have an objective process which measures both output as well as inputs and efforts, right? And the last principle I would say is about the continuous nature of feedback. I think one of the days where we do these appraisals once in 6 months or once in a year, I think people do look forward to have a continuous feedback. So how do we enable that? I think the tools which are designed, does it enable a continuous feedback? Is a review happening more often? Conversation to ensure these goals which is set is not necessarily cast in stone, right? We got to make sure that these are dynamic enough to, to stay relevant to the context of the business that we are in. So how do we continuously, exchange feedback, fine tune our efforts, so that collectively we learn on the go, right? So feedback is a necessary input for the individual to learn, as well as fine tune the efforts towards the broader direction towards which we want to move. These are the few things I believe is very important building blocks as we design the performance management process. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks, Naveen, for that. I also like the way you were able to articulate the way the things have evolved, right? Whether it is the process itself becoming more continuous and regular to give feedback. You spoke about the business alignment. It's no longer only like a separate people process which is run. You spoke about also how some of it has become more bottoms up than just top down from a goal standpoint. And the last point I really like, which is the new generation is saying, don't judge me, right? And don't like put a number to me. Rather, you give me qualitative feedback, which will help me grow, which will help me develop. So thanks for sharing that. I wanted to double click on one of the points you mentioned, how perf can be designed as something which can really help power the business goals, right? And always there's a talk about how can perf help me achieve this almost mythical high performance bar. Everybody wants a high performance bar to be maintained in the company, while at the same time without diluting the culture or the cultural principles, right? Like culture can be different, but nobody wants to be in a culture where you have detractor behaviors or toxic behaviors, right? So high performance bar, good culture. How can perf help drive them? Maybe if you can draw from your experience of having seen this play out, and maybe what is that secret recipe? And I mean, if at all there is one.
Absolutely. I'll attempt answering it based on my experience or insights that I've gained over a period of time. I think, see, it's about how you define performance. Is it only about what you do, or it's also about how you do it, right? In my view, both are important. If you go in one direction, which is only about what, then you will find many brilliant jerks in the system, which not necessarily helps you to build a great organization, because it's not only about delivering results, it's also about inspiring people around you, right? How do you motivate? How do you create an ecosystem which is inclusive enough for people to find their space, express themselves, bring their best, challenge each other, conflicts are embraced in a right way, etc., etc. So it's important that we create a mechanism, a performance management mechanism, which sort of values both these aspects of performance, right? I think the way we have done is in our context, we defined performance as combination of what and how. What being the results you deliver, which is the concrete results which you have taken up, either as a aspirational or committed OKRs within the organization, or the behaviors, which is values that organization has, right? How are you embracing that as you deliver these results, right? The type of conversations that you have, how you take people along. Are you a experience accretive individual, or someone who dilutes the cultural quotient of the organization, right? Both are very important. You can be a great performer in terms of delivering the results. But if you're not a great performer in terms of building the right culture within the team, then obviously it is of not much use, because you don't provide larger organizational leverage with your presence if you're a unidimensional performer. So I think embedding both these things in the framework is important. And how do you bring it alive? Because again, staying away from being judged, right? So you got to have an objective process within the system to be able to assess the performance, right? So perhaps results are a little more straightforward. Numbers perhaps speak for themselves, but not that every function has numbers to talk about, right? There's a lot of qualitative work that you do as well. So having a talent committee, right? I think we may be discussing that in a little more detail later, but talent committee is an important or talent discussion process is an important mechanism which helps us to drive greater rigor on this and have an objective conversation, right? When group of people, including stakeholders, discuss about the concrete business results people have delivered, as well as the way they have delivered, it allows us to stay away from the personal biases which one or two individual may have, right? Because we are in the talent discussion, you will have multiple people, which includes your stakeholders, your own line manager, right? Which the conversation becomes much more holistic, not only to assess, but also to ensure that we collect a very meaningful feedback for the individuals, right? Because performance management is not only about assessing people, it's also about developing people. How do you make sure that you're able to collect that objective feedback to the individual, give them in a constructive manner so that they can digest it well and action those inputs to develop themselves so that they can scale along with the organization. One of the demerits, right, in startup ecosystem is organizations scale much faster than people, right? Because when you're growing the organization in more than 100%, perhaps quarter on quarter, many cases you would have seen that. Even if it happens in once a year, 100% growth, over a period of time, you will see that some people may not mature to the extent that organizational scale can be managed with the same people at the same level. So how do you make sure that you scale people along with the organization is an important challenge for organization. I mean, for HR function as well as to the leaders. So being able to have this conversation on time and being able to do this very frequently and pass on this feedback is very important. There are organizations who do it well. And there are organizations who do not prioritize. I guess that's where good and great organizations are differentiated.
Cool, great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Naveen. And I really like the fact that you mentioned about how it goes down to the design, right? Where how you have a what and a how component to it, and just what there is a risk of brilliant jerks getting created in the system. So mix of what and how, and then having a conversation around it, so that you're able to calibrate well, and then and that sort of then becomes the bedrock of ensuring that the bar is maintained, but at the same time, culture is also not getting diluted. That's good to hear. You also mentioned about the very classic 0 to 1 talent problem. I keep getting questions often, right, saying that, hey, I have folks who have grown with me, but now I feel the org has outgrown them, right? It's what do we do? I'm too emotionally invested. They have taken the org so far, so I don't want to also have a hard conversation, but at the same time, so what do I do? So I think you alluded to it, which is just have a conversation on them regularly on what and how, and see if there is a possibility to actually set them up well or develop them, right? And unless there is nothing, I think you don't need to have the difficult conversation. Thanks for sharing that, Naveen. Also, I think it would be good to get a very quick reflection from folks who are on the call in terms of whether the perf process you have, do you think it actually helps you drive the kind of culture you want to have and the kind of performance bar you want to have in the company, right? So it's a reflective question. Would be good to hear from folks in the call. I think we'll take 30 seconds and then we'll see what are the results. Thank you. Thanks everyone for answering. Adi, can we have the results? Okay. Okay, cool. Interesting. Interesting to see that around 60-65% you have, when the remaining of you're you are not, and maybe some put for thought in terms of how you can design this, and hopefully some of the conversations we have been having have been useful in that regard. Okay, I'm going to move on now. The next topic I wanted to deep dive on, Naveen, is the topic you mentioned about the conversation itself on talent, right? The calibration conversation, which helps maintain fairness, helps maintain a uniform standard bar. Now, calibrations as a process exist in multiple places, but I think there is an art to it, there's a science to it. So one is just doing it as a tick in a box mechanical process, which might not lead to the best outcomes. But the other thing is really like doing it in its true spirit, which typically leads to fairness getting increased, leads to your performance bar being maintained, and also high quality feedback going to talent, right? Would want to hear from you, from your experience. What are some of it can be a tactical one, or it can be like some framework aspects which you have seen really elevate the conversation around talent in these calibration sessions?
Yeah, so I think one is about creating that mechanism, right? Very important. I think tick in the box will never get its due credibility, and without credibility, none of these things will be valued, right? It will not deliver the result. So in establishing the right credibility for this process is utmost important. How do you do that? I think the rigor is the answer, right? And stay true to what you say, right? You can evolve the rigor, but being truthful around this process is very important for you to establish this as a credible process. One, in terms of setting this up, so making sure that you have right people who are represented in that talent discussion, so that you are able to get a very rounded feedback on the individual concerned, right? Whether it is about the results that they deliver, or about the behaviors that they bring on, create culture on, right? The second part, I guess, is to make sure that we have a common understanding of performance bar, right? Because otherwise people tend to go with their perception of the world. I think otherwise it'll become more subjective as well. So it's important to establish a bar for conversation, as well as what do we mean by various terminologies when we assess the people, right? And so that we can stay away from the biases which can play out at different point in time. And third, according to me, having the right process for conversation is important. Otherwise what happens is people with the higher authority, right, or hierarchically senior people, their voices will be heard more than others. Your intention is not to create such environment. You want to hear very objective feedback about individuals. So having a process where everybody has an opportunity to speak and go in a way that you're able to extract in the feedback before most senior person in the room speaks about them, so that people don't go by either confirmation bias or any other biases which can really not help us to get the right approach. So rigor of the conversation and being able to discuss each and every person in the room. You should never rush. I think there are many times, there are temptations, right? you want to finish this in X number of hours. Talent discussions are never done. I mean, at least according to me, while time management is important, but it's very important to make sure that the quality of conversation is never compromised to rush the conversation. So how do you make sure that you have right process to do that? You have right stakeholders, and you have data-based conversation, especially regarding the business result side. And for behaviors, perception should never be spoken about, right? You got to have incidents which left a certain impact on the individuals being spoken about, rather than I feel so sort of conversation, which is a judgmental conversations, right? Or biased conversation based on one's perception of the world or perception of the individual. So how do you drive a lot more objectivity? The languages does matter. I think initially when you set the tone, slowly it gets crept into the system. But I guess making sure that you have a process to discuss each and every individual is very, very important. Yeah.
Understand. Got it. Thank you. Now the question around how often do you do it? And how often do you do it? I know you talked at the start about how there has been an evolution on that as well, right? It's a little bit like you listen to your customers continuously, so why don't you listen to your people in that same frequency? Might be helpful to get some feedback from the group, comments from the group, and then maybe we can have a conversation around that, Naveen. Adi, if you can float a question around this to the group. There can be also other ways to do it. We have 4 choices here, but in case you do it in some other way, then please do log it in the comment box. So, for example, there are companies we have worked with where we have seen that they do it like every month basis date of joining, so that the entire process is distributed across the 12 months. So there are other innovative ways also perf is done. So if you have something like that, then please do log it in your comment box, else please vote on the poll. Okay, cool, interesting. 31% is still annually, Naveen, which is still things are not fully changed, right?
Yeah.
Though I think there is a movement towards doing it more frequently. 21% quarterly is interesting. 10% continuous is interesting. Again, would be helpful to understand. I've seen that even usually when it is continuous, the impact, the challenges in a startup kind of ecosystem, do people really have the discipline and the rigor to do it continuously, right? So these are some questions which come to my mind. Over to you, Naveen, to comment on this, on how often do you do?
Yeah, I think again it's a contextual. I think in a very incremental business growth environment, perhaps you can look at biannual or annual process where the context or business context is much more predictable. You have well-laid plans, and you know the template to get there, right? So in such context, perhaps that's more relevant. But in a startup context where we are part of a VUCA world, right, where things are not necessarily stable, it's a volatile environment. So in that context, perhaps we need course corrections more often, right? That's one of the reasons why people in startup world do the quarterly OKR process more often than other processes, which allows us to sort of course correct in terms of approach. What are the few things we need to do, prioritization, as well as ensure that the whole organization is driven towards certain milestones that we agree in the quarter's context, right? So when there is a approach to drive business, in that approach, perhaps even the performance management approach also need to align with it, because end of the day, performance management is not necessarily HR process. For me, it is a business process to really drive collective efforts, right? So again, the answer is contextual. Perhaps, and I would recommend, or I would say that in our context, more relevant thing to do is quarterly. But I think continuous feedback mechanism is something which has to be done either way, right? Because you cannot wait for a particular timeline to give a feedback to your team member. It has to be a ongoing discussion about things that are happening so that you can enable the individual. Purpose is to enable the individual, those feedback conversations. At the same time, you are able to manage your bandwidth well, right? So continuous feedback, but at least a little more concrete conversations around the status of goals, what are the reprioritizations which are required, and documentation of that perhaps can happen once a quarter in startup context. But in a predictable environment, perhaps you can look at a little more longer duration for doing this process. I think that's what, at least the practice wise, I have seen this evolve. Perhaps it's relevant. I don't think we can say that there is a single approach to drive this. It's just in a business context should determine the approach that we have.
Okay, cool. Super. Thanks for sharing that. Now, the one thing, in the other day, I was talking to a set of HR leaders, and we were discussing about perf, and everybody had their own kind of approach towards how they were designed. But the one question which was top of mind was that, yes, we have done all this design, but how do you ensure that people participate in it, with the true spirit? They give good feedback, rich feedback, and how it gets closed on time, right? That is like a huge problem. People don't feel feedback on time. People don't feel good feedback. You have to send it back. And then it gets complicated if you're using 360 feedback, because you're getting feedback from across the org for multiple people. So I heard a lot of angst. And in fact, I was also chatting with my product person, and he was also asking, Arun, what is the incentivization for people to do this, right? And to fill feedback, good quality feedback, because I want to design for it. Because ultimately, how can it go beyond that, push? So, Naveen, would be good to hear from you. I don't know that there is a magic pill, but some things, right? Some maybe process aspects or tactical things or products also, which has helped you drive this process. Because I think also the process being driven with the right rigor and speed is also equally important, right? And the people also doing it in a quality way is also important. So even if you have a great design on paper. So Naveen, over to you.
So I think here, so slight, the way I would look at 360 and PMS, I'll talk about PMS approach, etc. I would not mix these two, because 360 is primarily for developmental purpose, right? So you don't want to coincide that with the evaluation, because you don't want a situation where you scratch my back, I scratch your back type of situation where people do not necessarily give a objective feedback. So 360 is primarily for development, right? So de-link that. But when I'm talking about 360-degree feedback mechanism, not the talent discussion. Talent discussion, of course, is for the evaluation purpose. Now, PMS, it's a major puzzle, right? Which all of us try and solve. Over a period of time, things have changed. I think a few years back, I was thinking, why finance processes can close dot on 31st March, why not HR, right? Then how do we bring little teeth to this whole process? Now, I think the answer is in making sure that the relevance is felt within the organization, right? So you need to have certain consequences attached to this not doing it. So how do you bring those linkages, right? PMS is important for reward. So linkage is very clear. Can you create different hook points through the year to be able to drive this? For example, there are organizations who do cash components in particular timeline, And rather in the startup world, ESOP is a prominent rewarding mechanism as well. They sort of time it in differently so that you are able to create different hook points through the course of the year for people to feel rewarded, right? So when you tie them into the PMS process, people know that this is important for me to do it. So that's one reason. Second is, I guess, clarity is the core principle, right? And if I don't have a clarity, perhaps I can't do anything in life, right? So PMS process is the tool which provides you clarity in terms of what you are expected to, what's the quality of results which are expected, and perhaps even define what it takes to get there, so the smaller milestones to really deliver your core OKRs and stuff like that. So it's a process of arriving clarity. So who doesn't need clarity? Everyone needs clarity. So can we use this as a process to drive it? So making sure that this is done on time. So if leadership sets an example within the organization that org OKRs are defined well in advance. We are in October, meaning October, November, December quarter. Before we start October, if you have defined org OKR, perhaps you are in a better shape to influence the rigor within the organization. Perhaps if you delay it, there is a risk of you not being able to set the right tone for the performance culture. So I think leadership being able to acknowledge this importance and drive similar rigor across the organization by doing it timely manner. And second, attach certain consequences. If it is not done by X date, shut the site, right? So you'll not be able to touch it. So drive certain consequences that, okay, you got to do it in certain timeline. If not, you will not have OKR for the quarter, which means nobody wants to be in a situation where they do not have OKR, right? Because end of the quarter, there will be some evaluation process, there will be some conversation. And if they have nothing to present, then that will be an embarrassing thing for people. So how do you create that importance to it? By leadership, examples, or in terms of lead by examples to provide the right clarity, making sure that there is a consequences attached to for not doing these things, and then creating certain hooks which matters to the people, right? Reward hooks at different point in time through the course of the year in different formats, right? So that people know that this is how this logical cycle ends, right? So that people are able to take it seriously. These are a few things I tried personally. Some of them worked, yeah. Some of them also is part of culture. Is how do you set the culture is important for you to get some of these results.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing those. One last question from my end before I move on to audience questions. There are around 10 questions which have already been logged, and also folks on the call, please feel free to log more questions. We'll quickly come to that. So Naveen, the tooling around it, I think beyond a point, sheets, forms don't work. I mean, in my experience, I've seen 100 people, and beyond that, that doesn't work. So you need a tool around it. Now, how do you go about selecting that tool? What is the criteria you keep in mind? I know one definite criteria is that design the process and then have the tool, and don't have the tool design the process. A very basic principle. But beyond that, how do you think about the tooling around it? And in experience, what are the criteria which has sort of really helped have a good tool support to really scale this process and deliver this process in the right way, Naveen?
Yeah, so I think very important aspect of performance management. Perhaps 2 decades back, this is not as relevant. Today, it's without that, Gen Zs perhaps don't want to interact with it. So tech enabled, and tech also needs to be very intuitive, right? We don't want a platform which is not user friendly, right? So it has to be very user friendly. Maybe some sort of single stack approach rather than multiple modules coming together, right? Which also creates complexities, right? A tool which helps you to, do everything related to performance as well as the reward in a way, or, the engagement piece and stuff like that. If you can have a full stack sort of approach towards this, it lands better. People don't want to log into multiple systems to do things. They want to everything to be in one place, right? Cost is definitely one of those criteria, and as enterprises choose this. But I guess if you look at it from a people perspective, it is the intuitiveness of the tool, user friendliness, and making sure that everything is in one place. It's simple to use. You are able to get a data in one single place, to be able to, and then something in a way integrating business process and this one, for example, performance results, if it can be easily available, the business data for people to fill their information about performance, if it can be integrated well, I think it's seen as a user friendly mechanism for people to complete this. So I think very important. Without this, obviously you will not be able to drive a greater rigor. Excel and obviously the paper based approach will not work, right? So this is something which has evolved over a period of time. Earlier we used to have different modules for each of the small elements which are there in performance management, but I guess now there are a lot more tools, including the one which you have, Arun, which helps the organization to really do it in a faster, at the same time simplified approach, way it will help the organization to do it easier way, right? Without having to put too much of brain behind the whole thing. Yeah.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. And also would want to hear from the audience as well in terms of what has been their top priority when picking a perf tool. And I mean, you spoke about things like the configurability, you spoke about the UI UX of the tool, the alignment to the business process, so on and so forth. Would be also good to get some thoughts from the audience. Okay, looks like a split what everybody has their own point of view in terms of what is top priority. Okay, interesting. And also I'm assuming it has also a role to play with respect to what is top of mind for you, what is your process, what is your company. So, okay, good to see this. And specialization and depth, where almost 17 folks have answered. That also is encouraging, because that means there is a need for some of the process design nuances getting driven by the tool. I think that is sort of coming, which is great. Okay, cool. I am done with my questions. Naveen, I think we have a bunch of questions which have been asked by the audience. Audience, please log more questions. But I'm going to pick up few questions and have a conversation around it. And there are a couple of questions around a very, very important one, which is one Shashank Shekhar has asked. One more Anuj Deshmukh has also asked a very similar theme. The question is, how do you really empower and trust second level leaders on handling performance review committees? And Anuj is asking again the same theme but a meta question, which is what are the suggestions on enhancing manager effectiveness in driving and achieving the objectives of perf? Because ultimately the quality of the interactions managers have is the most important aspect of achieving high performance culture, right? So in a way, centrally you can do all the design, you can have the great tool and all of that, but ultimately the ultimate execution lies with managers and leaders. And what has been your point of view on this, or what has been your experience with this? I mean,
a very, very important call out, right? I think without managers are organization, right? I think we can keep talking about building organization, building culture. Managers create 80-90% of it, right? By the with the way they create the climate within the team, right? So it has to be brought alive by the managers to the team members. So how do we do that? $1 million question. I think more easier in a slightly evolved, stable environments, because organizations have been there for some time. A lot of work in terms of developing people would have gone in a startup context. This is one of those puzzles which all of us do struggle. I think the answer in terms of making sure that managers know first, they should know what it entails, right? Manager is not about managing people for results only. It's also about building the right culture, ensuring that your people grow. Perhaps they're ready to replace you at some point in time. So insecure leaders will never be able to build a great team, right? So you need managers who thinks very progressive, who thinks future forward, who thinks about building the organization and not insecure, and perhaps not worried about giving constructive feedback. We don't want pleasing managers who hide behind HR processes and perhaps say that this rating is because HR said this is how it has to be done. Rather than one has to have courage to tell the facts as is, make it very objective by talking to people, gaining the feedback through the talent conversation or otherwise, and really being able to have those objective conversations. So I think a lot of efforts required in terms of developing managers. One, letting them know what is expected. Second, equipping them with the right skill sets. There are enough and more contents which are available, whether it's first-time manager or middle managers or senior leadership, right? You got to have different approaches to develop them. But I think ensuring that these capability framework is there for managers to, one, understand, and second, build their managerial skills is very important. And second, as we said, right, as we keep saying, measures drive behaviors, right? Or measures drive results. So sometime having a managerial effectiveness, measures, which I think, in your model, Arun, engagement model, MRX is one thing which we really found it useful. This is Manager Recommendation Index, where managers are rated by the team members, right, on various aspects. It's also provided with some more questions around whether your manager is having one-on-one conversation with you, do they give developmental not able to do some of these things, you will not be able to command the respect of the team. Yeah, you should command respect, not demand respect, right? So how do you ensure that managers do have capabilities to really nurture these aspects so that you can create a great culture within the team? Yeah, and leverage what organization is creating in terms of policy framework, in terms of benefits framework, and everything that organization does will only come alive if managers do a justice to it, right? Managers bring it alive and use it with much more ownership, so that people don't feel entitled about it. They feel happy about some of these enablers being created to enable them to perform well. Yeah. So feeling entitled and feeling enabled is two different things, and how managers play a significant role in creating these mindsets amongst our people.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Thanks for that, Naveen. And also, I'll also add my 2 cents to it. It's a journey. So I remember back at Flipkart, we had taken this a goal to increase quality of manager feedback, peer feedback, self-feedback. I think it took like almost 4 cycles to start seeing results. And as Naveen, you mentioned, what really helped was really solve for it as an item. So for calibrations, simulating calibrations helped, which means before people who are going to do calibrations for the first time, do a mock calibration, where you almost simulate it, take a sample packet, do it, debrief, say that this is not right, this is not right, and also have some mock cases which are recorded. All of that helped. For peer feedback and for manager feedback. Again, capability building sessions helped. I remember we did something called Learning Cafe, some 50-minute bite-sized content where people came, learned about this is the way you structure feedback, did some practicing, did some thoughts exchange. It's a journey, and often and also what happens is like when you get the basics in place, then you start thinking about this. Because when you don't have the basics in place, then typically then you don't get into these things. So, but to the folks who have asked the question, great question. Both are very, very important to deliver, and starting off that journey is very, very helpful. There are other very interesting questions which have come. I like the question from the anonymous attendee, so I don't know the name, but we sometimes come across some of the key people that tend to quit just before some of the critical project deployment, right? Startups may be dependent. How do we get away with it? Dilutes perf. I like this question. I have my answer as well, but Naveen, I will let you go first.
Okay, sorry, my power has gone off, but I think I'm able to hear you.
Yeah.
So it's about people quitting before the critical incidents, right? Is that the question, Arun?
Yes. Just before a critical project deployment. I think the essence of the question is people threatening that, boss, if you don't give me a promotion, or if you don't give me this rating, or if you don't give me this reward, I'll just go away, right? Because I have my own market. Now, what do you do?
Yeah. So I think great performers with the right approach may not do that very often. But yeah, this tactical approach is seen very often as well. Yeah. How do you deal with it? I think one thing, build a great talent pipeline in your organization, right? For me, it's all about, do you have a talent density within the team to be able to, manage any situation on talent? Yeah. So if there is a manager and, do you have enough depth in the team to be able to make anyone indispensable, right? Or dispensable rather, right? I think that's very important as we look at building the organization. If you do not do that, people will become indispensable and you become vulnerable, right, in the process. Because as an organization, you got to build and have right capabilities to deliver on key results. And if you do not have talent and the succession depth, perhaps you will end up honoring those or arm twisting tactics of the people, etc. But my approach would always be to make sure that organization has the right talent depth to be able to deal with any of these situations. So we should not, left to me, and if I have enough options, I would not budge. I would rather push them to look at possibilities and type of impact they can create. Reward and everything else is the byproduct of the effort and impact you make. And the great people who keep doing impacts always outperforms on every parameters of what they do, right? Whether in terms of their gain, in terms of reward and wealth creation opportunities. And if they play long term, the trust and credibility only multiplies. When it multiplies, everything else also multiplies. So, and then they will scale with the organization. You don't need to hire perhaps people from outside to replace them, right? Because these people have avenues to grow. Many opportunities in a growing environment will open up, and they'll be pushed to look at different problem statements. So great people will never have dearth of opportunities, and with that, reward and everything else fall in place. But there are some tactical players with whom you need to, obviously, one, you need to know them. Second, you need to ring fence the org first, right? When I say ring fence the org, make sure that you have a good capability depth, irrespective, right? Whether you have a talent problem or not. I think this is the only insurance which will help your organization to really scale without any hurdles. And it's easier said than done, right? It's a hard work. It's years of effort which we need to put behind talent development to get there.
Yeah. So my take on that is that Naveen, you mentioned about encourage them, look for opportunities inside, etc. My thing would be like, why don't you look for opportunities outside in case you are not like, you really want that promo, etc. And also because there are, and I understand that, there are places where you can't and you will have to solve tactically, there's no escaping from it. But there are multiple places where I've seen the cost of this having, on the culture. There is um, like a digital agency, a startup, which is one of the top agencies in the country, where the same thing was happening with the chief creative officer. I can talk about multiple examples, say EdTech company where this was playing out, where when the founder and the HR team starts taking decisions uh, because the person is critical, ignoring the behavior itself, then it drives the behavior that was this person is more important. Second, I think this is the way the culture is, where I can actually go and have this conversation and hold people by threat, right? And in both these places, it was very detrimental because everybody else was unhappy. Culturally, it led to dilution, etc. So, I mean, these are two examples, but I'm pretty sure, I mean, you'd also seen, example after example. But yes, reality is reality. So some places you might have to tactically, do something for a quarter, 2 quarters. But how to ensure that in those 2 quarters you build the succession and the pipeline, etc. And I mean, as you rightly pointed out. Okay, cool.
It's a small world, right? Such people cannot keep doing it more often. So
yeah, correct.
you can get away 1 or 2 times, and by then your perception about them is built.
Yes.
And key people will know. An industry is small.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. If we can do it quickly. There is one question around OKRs, Hari Govind, and you had asked earlier on in the conversation. Maybe I can answer this first, and Naveen, you should add your 2 cents. Which is, do you have OKRs implemented across the org, or is it to select functions where you see there is far more dynamics front ending? So what about backend functions like quality, ops? Second one is, who drives OKR? Is it the founder's office or is it HR? We know line has to drive, but who owns, governs, runs the cadences? I'll quickly answer and I'll pass it on to Naveen. OKR implementation, in my experience, I've seen that it varies depending upon the business. There are places where it happens across the BUs and to a certain level. But typically it depends upon the scale of the org. But typically it is with L1, L2, in some cases L3, depending upon if the company is bigger. BUs, again, it depends. Tech, product, etc. typically stops at L1. Beyond that, it doesn't happen. And some support functions as well, L1, L2. But when you do perf, then it has to take into consideration that reality. So there'll be a part of people who are purely on OKRs, maybe at a leadership level. There are a set of people who are on OKRs and goals, because they are in that middle where some of them directly own OKRs and some of them are BAU goals matrices. And then you have a layer who is purely operating on numbers matrices. So the perf process then has to be designed across however you have implemented OKRs, right? And an OKR linkage is a debatable one. We can spend more time offline, which is, there is a philosophy around we shouldn't because OKRs will become sandbagged. And there is a philosophy around we should because OKR is a great process to drive continuity on goals and how that links to perf. On who drives it, it depends. In our experience, we have seen chief of staffs drive more. So, if you take the 300, 350 companies we have worked with, the next 80% would be chief of staff, 20% would be like with the HR team. But there's no reason why HR teams can't drive it. I'm often very honestly saying there are a lot of places I've seen that the HR teams don't pick it up and run it, or are not equipped to run it. But I think HR also has a great vantage point to run it within the company. So it has all the credibility, authority, vantage point to run it. But I think it really depends upon how things are set up in the company. Naveen, over to you.
I think you covered it, Arun. I think see the OKR, perhaps it best works for top 50, top 100, depending on the scale, right? Where you want, some of the focus areas are driven by the top 10, 100 people, right? And remaining people who are driven or the manage through core metrics of the business. If it's operations team, There are priorities which needs to be driven by certain people, but bottom of the pyramid metrics are common, right? Maybe the goalpost may change, but metrics remain the same. So you may not need OKR, but you need a tighter goal setting framework to manage the large of number of people who are in the bottom of the pyramid, right? But perhaps in the top and middle of the pyramid, you might want to experiment with OKR in a fast growth environment, right? Maybe in the incremental growth environment, perhaps approach could be slightly different. But faster growth environment, some of these tools really helps. Is my observation. On founder office versus HR, I think both can do it. It depends on the bandwidth, where you keep the bandwidth for this. It requires a lot of bandwidth in terms of one driving OKR process in terms of defining it, and also driving the governance around it, the conversations around progress, the review mechanism, making sure that we are able to do course corrections based on the context of the business during the course of the OKR period, those type of things. It's a real business work. And if HR is able to do that, why not? I guess who drives is not important. How it has to be driven. Can HR do that? Definitely, yes. But I think as Arun said, in most of the places you would see a founder's office folks picking it up because they're closer to few of those nuances, as part of being a strategy function within the organization.
Okay, cool, super. We are out of time. Thanks a lot, Naveen, for taking this time out to have this conversation. Has been fun and also enlightening to hear from your experience of how you have seen this particular process, which can be quite powerful, evolve over the years. Thanks for sharing those insights. Thanks, audience, for joining in and asking these brilliant questions. We couldn't answer everything, but more than happy to have a offline chat to chat more about some of these things in case required. And please fill the feedback form. Adi has filled the feedback form, has shared the feedback form, so please do that. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Adi, Riya, over.